Players gather to cast powerful spells, some of the oldest and most revered in the history of Magic the Gathering. Brainstorm, Nadu Winged Wisdom, Nomad's Encore, and many others. Battling head-to-head in brutal combat, they all have one thing in common: to uphold their legacy and the search for eternal glory.
The Eternal Glory podcast is brought to you by the minds behind Bosch and Roll on YouTube, Arabian University, and theepicstorm.com. This episode is sponsored by Moxfield and financial advisor and certified financial planner Nicholas Robb.
Hello, and welcome to episode 157 of the Eternal Glory podcast. Where is White? We've already recorded 30 minutes of introduction and banter for the week, available in our supporter-exclusive free show. Check out patreon.com/eternalglory to gain access, or join as a YouTube member for the same content on YouTube instead. As always, I'm Phil Gallagher, aka Thraben U.
I'm Brian Coval, aka Bosch and Roll.
And I'm Bryant Cook of the Epic Storm.
Shout out to our new members since the last episode. We've got Potato David, 1987, who will enjoy the pre-show, which includes lots of sweet stories about Bryant's brand new baby, as well as some magic stuff. And, speaking of sweet updates, happy birthday, Lucas, from your fiance, Cassie. Fan of the show. Very sweet message from Cassie. Hope you had a good birthday, Lucas.
To win in Magic, adjust your strategy as the game changes. The same is true of investments. Nicholas Robb, financial advisor and certified financial planner, can help you create a game plan for your financial goals. Call 314-377-9524 or email nicholas.ropp@edwardjones.com. That's nicholas.raupp@edwardjones.com to get started today. Edward Jones, member SIPC.
And if you're interested in advertising to 10,000 plus Eternal gamers every episode, reach out to us. We're always accepting new sponsors.
And that brings us to our topic for the week, which is white cards. Where are they, is the question. You have to go pretty deep into the Goldfish or top 8 metagame to find a deck with white cards in it. I believe at the time of this recording, deck number 10 is Nadu Breakfast, and there's not a single white card ahead of that on the rankings at all. And then it's a pretty big gap after that as well. So where are the white cards? And we're going to frame that in kind of a history lesson. What are white cards good at historically? What is their role in Legacy? And then we'll ask, why isn't that role important right now?
Okay, quick question before we get started. Is white one of the colors in Dimir?
I'm checking. No.
Rough. Okay, that's going to explain a lot, but let's go down the history rabbit hole first. And so what's white good at? The first thing that comes to mind for me is removal. White is the best color at getting rid of stuff in Legacy, or probably any format, honestly, because not only are its removal spells generic, but they also tend to exile. So in this format where Reanimate is incredibly popular, that means that they don't come back. So you've got your classic Legacy white removal spell in the form of Swords to Plowshares, and the removal has only gotten better over time. Well, the supplementary removal. Swords is sort of the gold standard.
Yeah, I don't think there is a better removal spell in Magic the Gathering than Swords to Plowshares. Richard Garfield kind of blasted that one into the sun in Alpha, and I can't even imagine what a better removal spell than Plow would look like, and I hope we never see it.
I think the counter argument would be Lightning Bolt, but they're pretty close, like Lightning Bolt versus Swords to Plowshares. But it's interesting because Dimir's at the top of the format, and it has worse removal, yet it's everywhere. And I remember a couple of years ago, we were saying, where's black? Where's black? It turns out that you just have to push your threats so far ahead of where your removal is that the removal no longer matters nearly as much.
Yeah, and I want to loop back to this idea of black removal being worse in a couple of minutes. As far as the white removal goes, a while back it's probably a very while back now. When did Prismatic Ending come out? What set was that?
Oh, dude, that was like 6 years ago.
MH2?
Ugh.
Was it 2 or was it 1?
I think it's MH2.
All right, let's look it up. Yeah, you might be right. I feel like I've had it forever, honestly.
Looks like Modern Horizons 2.
It is Modern Horizons 2. Okay, so it's like 4 years ago, not 6. A little better.
All right, well, Modern Horizons 2 gave us a pretty good removal spell for creatures that also hit most other things. And so that was 2021. So yeah, 4 years ago. And we got Leyline Binding as another pretty good catch-all that, requires some setup, but eventually does become that 1 mana answer just about anything. And if you need to answer more than one thing at once, White has that too. Terminus was a defining card of Legacy for a very long time. Supreme Verdict used to be a premium mass removal card in Legacy, although things like Wrath of the Skies that are a little bit lower to the ground tend to replace that in White sideboards these days.
Do you remember when the Wizards released the BNR update where they were talking about Leyline Binding have a huge impact on Legacy, even though it wasn't seeing any play? And then just a few months later, it started seeing tons of play. So Wizards was just like ahead of the curve.
Well, they knew Up the Beanstalk was coming, and we didn't. Though they have said that Up the Beanstalk was just a signpost uncommon for limited, so they didn't even know Up the Beanstalk was coming. They were just making random noises when they were talking about Leyline Binding. But Leyline Binding and Prismatic Ending are really interesting cards to be missing from the metagame right now. And you can find them. There are White decks, and we're going to talk about some of them, but they're really deep into the metagame. None of the top tier decks are playing these cards. And the top tier decks are almost all playing Tamiyo. Like, I think this format is largely defined by Tamiyo. If I could ban one card from Legacy, it would be Tamiyo. And Prismatic Ending and Leyline Binding catch her as a creature and catch her as a planeswalker. Those games where you can never fatal push Tamiyo because you think your opponent might have Brainstorm simply don't matter if your removal looks like this instead of like fatal push. The shells are not there to support these things right now, which is a shame, because if Prismatic Ending was competitive right now, maybe Tamiyo wouldn't be so bad. But Prismatic Ending is horrendous versus Archon of Cruelty.
So what else is White supposed to be good at? Removal is, I think, the clearest thing. Where else are we going in Legacy with White?
They have some pretty good creatures, historically. We've got, basically, we can break Death and Taxes out into kind of some bubbles of value monsters and lock pieces, both of which White has in significant spades. Like, we've got Stoneforge Mystic, Recruiter of the Guard, newer but instant impact Thalia, Exuberant Shepherd, the classic Thalia, and then every other White Hate Bear thing, Containment Priest, even Drannith Magistrate gets played in some Eternal formats when the format's right for it. Those are all like really good. Like, basically the core of Death and Taxes is a white creature deck. So it's based entirely on the power of what this color can do with its bodies.
And a lot of those are value-oriented, enters the battlefield creatures. And that is a big thing that White is doing, which is separate from the Hate Bear stuff. So even though there's some overlap, the creatures that you see in an ETB trigger deck like Death and Taxes might be pretty different from what you see in a stompy deck featuring Ancient Tomb that is trying to power out the Archon of Amerias and the Anointed Peacekeepers of the world.
Yep, White's creatures are also historically really well paired with blue counters. The classic blue-white control, that goes back to the beginning of Magic as well, and various shades of it. Even the Jeskai decks today kind of splash red for their Flames of Anor, but they're base blue-white. And control finishers historically, Monastery Mentor, Triumph of St. Catherine, Timeless Dragon, Wandering Emperor, Fourth Air Lingus. I mean, that's a gold card, but it's white. And even looping back, Stoneforge Mystic doing double duty. Sometimes it's value, sometimes it's a control win con. Just that used to be the gold standard of what a creature could do in this format, and it's almost nowhere right now.
If you think back to the golden era of Legacy, where people used to watch Star City games all day on Sunday, those Legacy Opens, Stoneforge Mystic was the defining card of the format, in my opinion. It was a lot of Stoneblade mirrors, and Legacy has kind of just moved past that, and I think a lot of people want that nostalgic feeling again.
I loved that era of Stoneforges, Snapcaster Mages, and Lingering Souls. It was good, honest, grindy magic. Back before I think we even put 4 Ponders into all of our legacy decks.
Yeah, and I think more than nostalgia for that time period, which those who experienced it do have, it's also just really good fundamental magic. It's like this Stoneforge Mystic, it's cheap, it arrives, it doesn't have much of a body of its own, but it's good for a card immediately. And then the gameplay of, do I get something small like a Cryptic Coat to curve out, or do I get something big like Cauldra and hope they don't have a removal spell? Or do I get something like Batterskull that lands in the middle? And now there's so many things. There's like Assimilation Aegis, that's an Oblivion Ring that's an equipment. And there's so many things that a Stoneforge Mystic can do. And if you're the person with 1 Swords to Plowshares, do you plow the Stoneforge Mystic before it gets to activate? Or do you make them commit their Cauldra, then plow the Germ and leave the Cauldra sitting around for a while? And the answer might be different depending on whether they're a blue deck or a white deck. And this is just really good, fundamental 2-for-1s, changing resources magic that a lot of Legacy has gotten away from.
Pre-war Farmalware is another great one in that category.
So guys, why can't we do these things in Legacy? Like, what is stopping us from playing all these great white cards?
So I think there's a lot of ways to answer this. And I wrote some in the show notes, and I came up with some more since I was doing the writing. But I think for a lot of people in the current metagame, it is really hard to not just be playing a blue-black deck. When the format is north of 50% combo, having access to Thoughtseize, Daze, and Force of Will as sort of a trifecta to just generically stop all the unfair things that people are doing, like that is such an attractive prospect.
Yeah, I think Thoughtseize is the most important card in this format right now. I think Tamiyo is the defining card, but I think Thoughtseize is the most important card, whether you are trying to do the 6 stuff or trying to stop the 6 stuff. Thoughtseize is just the way to do it. And the fact that the combo decks, or even the aggressive tempo combo, whatever decks, even the mid-range decks are all playing Thoughtseize so they can fight the combo decks. That makes things like White is phenomenal at having sideboard cards. That's another thing White is very good at. That's like your Rest in Pieces, your Stony Silences, Containment Priest, Deafening Silence. There's a lot of mess up white cards that come in out of the sideboard, but Rest in Peace doesn't matter if Thoughtseize and Daze are happening out of the combo deck that you're trying to resolve this 2-drop against. In Reanimator, if they're on the play, they just have Archon of Cruelty before you have Rest in Peace, whether it's protected or not. And if they suspect anything like that, they just have so much interaction that costs 1 or 0 mana that resolving a 2-drop that changes the game is not really where we are anymore as a society.
I recently resolved a Rest in Peace. And man, once I did, it was the best thing ever. And it's something that shuts off the Reanimator stuff. It shuts off your Nethergoyfs. It shuts off your Murktide Regents. It shuts off the Barrowgoyfs. It just does everything you could possibly want a card to do.
It shuts down the Tamiyo minus, and all she could do is plus to the moon and hope she gets there. Yeah, a card like that is really good if it's in play. But 2 mana is the new 5. Like, it's just 2 mana sounds like, or it feels like you're a lifetime away from it when you keep that opening hand on the draw and you're like, well, I have 2 lands and a Rest in Peace. Hope we get there.
Yeah, you need something to get you to your turn 2 hate card.
Right.
And since we mentioned Tamiyo, I think Tamiyo is a big reason why decks aren't white. They don't have to be. Tamiyo is card advantage in the form of the clues. Tamiyo is extra copies of your spells in forms of the Planeswalker minus. Tamiyo is an eventual win condition. Just drawing half your deck, you will win the game somehow. It doesn't matter what's in your deck. It doesn't matter what you do. That Tamiyo Ultimate will win you the game. So you don't need to splash the 4th Aerlingas. You don't need to splash the Triumph of St. Catherine. You just don't need it because Tamiyo just wins games.
Yeah, we were talking a moment ago about Stoneforge Mystic being that rock solid, comes down to 2 mana, maybe threatens the game with a Cauldron, maybe threatens value with Cryptic Code or Formal Wear. Tamiyo threatens all of those things for 1 mana and is worth more cards the longer it stays in play, and has built-in removal protection because every Tamiyo deck also plays Brainstorm. It's just kind of embarrassing to think about anything else that your blue deck could do. And this is also, like, when I'm thinking about, like, I think about building control decks a lot, like where Uro and Teferi and Narset, these cards that I used to like a lot. Why is there no room for them now? And it's because the tempo decks just draw more cards than the control decks. And at that point, why are you trying to be a control deck? Like, a Tamiyo as a creature will draw +1 card per turn. A Tamiyo as a planeswalker is either good for a card every other turn or wins the game 4 turns later. If you can do all that for 1 mana, all in blue, why are we messing around with Flame of Enor or Triumph of St. Catherine or even up the Beanstalk? That juice is not worth the squeeze.
I think we're also underselling the plus ability that gives attacking creatures -1, -0, because historically white decks have been the answer for sweepers, like cards like Terminus, Wrath of the Skies, that sort of stuff. And you don't necessarily need white now to deal with a lot of creatures, like combo elves, for example. Decks full of 1/1s. Okay, I'll flip my Tamiyo plus. It's like, oh, now you have to do your big thing in order to push through any damage. So now you have to resolve natural order and play into my counter spell. Or if you don't play into it, I will eventually cantrip into it, and then you're just going to be set far behind. So I think like Tamiyo negating small creatures is also part of the problem. And I think Orcish Bowmasters gets a lot of the hate in this aspect. People claim that Orcish Bowmasters completely pushed 1 power and toughness creatures out of the format, but I think Tamiyo is actually the bigger culprit. Like, Tamiyo just invalidating small creatures altogether is part of the issue.
And if you've ever been on the Bowmaster side of a Tamiyo versus Bowmaster showdown, Bowmaster sucks. It seems weird to talk about how a 1-drop creature that's built to draw cards invalidates the 2-drop creatures that's built to punish drawing cards, but Bowmaster does not pressure Planeswalker Tamiyo. And you can't go ultimate into Bowmaster, you take 20 damage, but you have infinite time to figure it out, and somewhere along the line, Tamiyo will just minus instead of plus, kill the Bowmaster, and then get back to plussing. It is not good to be on the Bowmaster side of that face-off.
And on the fair creature side, like, I play a lot of Ocelot Pride decks. It doesn't matter how many cat tokens you have once that Tamiyo pluses. It shuts down so many of your early starts just by itself.
Earlier when we were talking about where's white, Phil, I'm glad you mentioned the Ocelot Pride energy decks, because in my head, those are the defining white decks of the format now. Like, I face energy all the time, but they play 4 Swords to Plowshares, but they're not playing Prismatic Ending or Leyline Binding or any of these other cards we're talking about. They're taking the broken MH3 shell that was printed, and then they're just adapting it into Legacy. And I think that's kind of awesome. If it's too good for Modern that it has a home here in Legacy, that's great. But those are the white decks when I think of Legacy in the current iteration in my head. And I don't know, I wouldn't mind like a true control deck somewhere.
I view the white core in Legacy right now as Ocelot Pride, Guide of Souls, Felia, Ajani, Nakatl, Pariah. Like, when I am building a white deck, those are the 4 creatures that I am thinking about. You know, Thalia is not a part of that core anymore and hasn't been for a very long time.
Yeah, it's interesting, this conversation about white deck, what is the identity of white, because in the rest of this episode, we're going to talk about where white is coming up, and spoiler, we're going to talk about a bunch of Simic decks that splash Swords to Plowshares, and we're going to talk about some blue-white decks, or some like Jeskai decks, where they're basically mono blue splashing white and red for removal. And like, what's the difference between a deck like Nadu that needs Nomads and Core, and since we're here, we put Swords to Plowshares in the deck, and a deck that is like, I want to play Plains, and I want to be happy about it. And those are 2 different things as well.
You're not going to catch me saying I want to play Plains, let me tell you that.
You're going to catch me saying that at the end of the episode. I think there is a sleeper pick from the Showcase Challenge.
I want to play exactly 2 basic planes, and I want a broad spread of fetch lands that can get them in the appropriate matchups. That's what I want to do in Legacy.
So we talked about this a little earlier, but black decks are playing removal that's like just okay enough to answer a number of things. Like black's best removal is probably Fatal Push, but if you compare that to Lightning Bolt or Swords to Plowshares, it's pretty far down in the rankings in my opinion. But the issue with Fatal Push is it doesn't hit Murktide Regent, it doesn't hit Atraxa, and like all these other large creatures. But when I'm looking at the current iterations of Reanimator or Dimir Tempo, I'm not seeing other removal, not really. Like there's cards you could be playing, but I think the answer that most people have come to is just don't let it happen. Like don't try to answer Atraxa or Archon of Cruelty after they've entered. You need to be playing Cling to Dust, Nile Spellbomb, Fairy Macabre, whatever. And I've seen now more than ever decks playing a main deck Soul Guide Lantern or a main deck Nile Spellbomb, because I think that's where we're at.
Brian, you played a pretty big tournament recently. If I'm not mistaken, didn't you play like 3 Spellbombs in the main of your deck?
Yes, at the Buffalo Chicken Dip Legacy, there were 200-person events on Saturday and Sunday, and then at the Steel City Spectacular, there was, I think, a 91-person event, maybe 94 or 5, 90-something. I played the same Dimir Tempo list in all of them, and I had 3 Nile Spellbombs. That is tech from Eco Baronin. There's a number of flex slots in those lists, and Eco Baronin basically dedicated all of them to making sure you don't lose to Graveyard Mess.
So as far as the main deck goes, I think Bryant is right. I think you should expect 4 Fatal Push kind of being the norm there from a lot of those decks. As far as the sideboard slots go, you'll occasionally see things like Go for the Throat or Bitter Triumph, but all of this stuff is missing something as opposed to the generic white catch-all removal. But if you're good enough versus most things, you don't need to make your mana worse. You don't need to go into that extra color. The current blue-black decks of various natures can afford a basic island, a basic swamp, and then some number of wastelands on top of that. And you probably have to lose out on those wastelands if you want to go into another color.
Right, and like with any deck, you have to think about the full package, like what the weaknesses are and what holes you need to plug. And a deck that is moving quickly and inevitably towards Archon of Cruelty does not need a Doomblade variant in the main deck. It doesn't need to go for the Throat or a Shoulder's Edict or a Shoot the Sheriff. Like Archon of Cruelty casts Cruel Ultimatum when it comes into play, a mini version, but if you can push the Tamiyo to stay alive long enough to trigger the Archon, now you don't care about Murktide Regent. It's dead on ETB or it's dead on combat, and your opponent will never have another creature again. And that's different than the decks like Dimir Tempo. Like they're trying to solve those sort of problems with a bunch of Brazen Borrowers or those main deck Nile Spellbombs I mentioned. Like we are worried about Murktide, and when you start to approach 5 cards in your graveyard, I'll Spellbomb you and buy a little time to get ahead of that. Eventually, Kaito Bane of Nightmares comes down to freeze it so we can get over the finish line. Thinking about it as a package rather than as every creature must be removed, because they don't. And you can ignore some of them or answer them creatively in other ways.
I think one more thing that I want to talk about real quick in this section is an obvious one, but this white removal is really good at removing things that are in play, but the stack is an entirely different zone, right? So every time that you pair against Bryant Cook, and it's just like Dark Ritual, bunch of artifact mana, Beseech the Mirror, Gaia's Will, go, 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 your Prismatic Endings and Swords to Plowshares and Leyline Bindings don't do very much there. When someone goes Dark Ritual, Doomsday, your white removal doesn't do things there. So even though overloading on white removal can be incredible at certain things, you're going to have to use your sideboard slots to address other problems that the white removal doesn't.
Earlier in this episode, Brian mentioned Deafening Silence at the end of a list of cards that were really good white sideboard cards. I remember when Deafening Silence was spoiled, and it was in Throne of Eldraine, but everybody was so focused on Oko during that time period. They're like, white didn't gain anything. And I was so upset because I was like, they just got a 1-mana rule of law. What else could you want? And people are like, we want something on the power level of Oko. And I was just livid. I was like, I can't believe they just got this 1-mana rule of law and they're complaining right now. And years later, I'm still upset about this card. Like, it is such a good sideboard tool for those decks that play white. And Phil's talking about game 1 having Swords to Plowshares in your hand. Yeah, that's sort of the issue with playing white, and I would agree. But you have absolute haymakers in your sideboard. Like, 1-mana rule of law should not exist. I don't care what anyone says.
And it's better than Rule of Law, because you could still Snapcaster through it. If your deck actually has creatures and spells, you get to do some stuff. Like, I've been playing a lot of Vintage lately, preparing for the Steel City Spectacular, and the difference between Deafening Silence and Archon of Emeria is just the world. Like, one spell. I had this crazy board state where my opponent, turn 1 Anointed Peacekeeper, naming Swords to Plowshares that was in my hand, and then they had a turn 2 Archon of Emeria, and my hand was like Dismember, Plow, Snapcaster, and I was like, there's got to be a way out of this. But there mostly wasn't. It was like, I have to dismember the Archon, or else I can't snap the Plow ever. And the Plow costs 3. And it was just like really difficult to solve that puzzle because of the difference. Like, if they had Deafening Silence instead, or even Thalia instead, it would have been different. You know, that 1 mana, slightly better than Rule of Law for the decks that want it, is super messed up.
Another thing I've been noticing recently is Stony Silence is seeing a big uptick due to the Mystic Forge deck. But some decks that could be playing Null Rod are choosing Stony Silence because it's often more difficult to remove. Being an enchantment is just slightly more difficult than an artifact, and I think that's pretty interesting as well.
I don't know if I agree with that. So Ugin Eye of the Storms exists, and the Ugin cast trigger answers Stony Silence, but it doesn't answer Null Rod. And that has come up in some of my recent videos.
I've been harsh on this for years. If you go back and watch the Vintage Super League, there is a match where I played against, I think it was Bob Marr, where he was on Blue Belcher and I was on Lands. And I played Stony Silences instead of Null Rods in my sideboard because they're, quote, harder to answer. But I have a hand that can't access white mana until turn 2, but did have 2 colorless on turn 1. And I died because I had Stony Silence and not Null Rod in my hand. And the type of decks where you want a Null Rod, you want it early and often. Like, I don't want to be, if you're mono white, maybe, whatever, do your thing. But even mono white decks probably have a bunch of Wastelands or whatever in there. Like, what if your hand is just 2 Wastelands, Stony Silence? I would probably keep 2 Wastelands Null Rod in the matchups where you want that. But 2 Wastelands Stony Silence is a mulligan. I don't know. I think that white pip is way more expensive than people think it is.
I'm open to being wrong. It's just something that I've read. Maybe I'm just completely off base here.
You're right. It is a thing that people think, but I think it is both incorrect and not worth the squeeze to get to that point. Like, there have been points in history where, like, Ancient Grudge is the answer people are packing or whatever, and that's just not the case anymore.
Yeah, on the note of mana, one of the decks that we're going to talk about from the Showcase Challenge has a Stony Silence in the sideboard. It has 22 lands, of which 7 of them are colorless. The white pip is a real cost.
Right, and if you want to balance the mana in your deck, Moxfield.com has that feature. They break out all of where your curve lies and how many colored pips and how many sources for each color. That happens automatically anytime you put a deck into Moxfield. That's one of many analytic tools.
All right, so let's talk practically about some white decks now. And I would like to start with Nadu here. And when we say Nadu is really a couple of different decks hiding in the same trench coat. So, Brian, you probably play the most of this deck of any of us here, so why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I just want to shout out, in the past month alone, like the month of August, which we're recording this on the 19th, we're talking about a 19-day stretch here. Larson, the reigning European Eternal Weekend winner with Nadu Breakfast, just won the 101-player European Legacy Masters and top 4 the 226-player Eternal Mania, both with Nadu Breakfast. At the Buffalo Chicken Dip tournaments, the 105-player main event had Nadu Breakfast in the finals. The 91-player Sunday event had Nadu Midrange in the top 8 and Nadu Elves in the top 4. The Steel City Spectacular, this one's crazy. The top 8 included 3 Nadu Midranges and a Nadu Breakfast. And then the Showcase Qualifier that just happened had Nadu Midrange in 3rd. And this is just in the past 2.5, 3 weeks. This deck is out there and it is putting up numbers, and especially in paper, which is interesting compared to Magic Online.
So Nadu is something that we have talked about on the pod a handful of time when like ban discussions come up. Like I think we all think that Nadu is incredibly powerful. And I think every time, as far as bannings go, we're always like, this isn't the best play patterns, but it's not one of the most broken things of the format right now. And I think the results we're seeing here like very much show that power, that borderline ban level power that Nadu is packing.
Right. So let's talk about the specific shells, and Breakfast is the most popular one. Earlier in the episode, I said you have to go 10 decks into the Goldfish metagame to find a white spell, and Nadu Breakfast is that deck. And last week on the pod, we talked about the Reanimator metagame and what you have to do to compete with Reanimator. And 2 of the things we said are wade through their threats, which usually involves exiling them. That sorts to Plowshares, or ignore them, dumpster over the top. And that's having your own combo. And Nadu Breakfast is a Force of Will backed turn 2 combo deck that also just gets to play a bunch of Swords to Plowshares and play a longer game if it chooses to.
It's infuriating playing against this deck because you have to respect a turn 2 combo, a turn 3 combo, and the just gross inevitability of random Nadu value. This is a tough deck to play against. And similarly to discussions we've had about Oops All spells, trying to interact with this deck can be frustrating. If you are trying to go the like Fairy Macabre route, they can be playing their own Memories Journey to not get disrupted and just immediately deck out when that happens. And if you shut off their graveyard, say with something hard like Rest in Peace, oh no, I'll just become a Nadu deck. I will draw 12 extra cards per turn cycle and just bury you alive.
Phil hit the nail on the head. Like, I really struggle. Like, I track all of my data for my personal matchups, and Breakfast is among the worst. I'm like 25 to 30% against Breakfast just because they have the turn 2 win. They have Forcible, they have Daze. They often have Prismatic Ending in the main as at least a 1 or 2 of on top of the Swords to Plowshares. And they're just so efficient. Like, if you, for some reason, let them live till turn 3, you do have to worry about Nadu plus Nomads into 12 plus cards per turn cycle like Phil mentioned, and all of a sudden you're never beating that. So they're a value deck, they're a graveyard combo deck, but they're also a Force of Will Daze deck. There's a lot going on here.
And something that a lot of people might not notice is happening if they're losing to Nadu, especially, or Nadu Breakfast, especially after board. They frequently board out the graveyard combo. Like Dread Return, Narcomoebas, they might not be in the deck at all after board. The Memories Journey, that's gone. So if you are going heavy, bringing in those Fairy Macabres, those Tormod's Crypts, those extra Endurances, whatever, you are playing into their hands. Like my sideboard map for Dimir Tempo, I cut forces, not all of them, but some of them, versus this deck. I do not bring in my Fairy Macabres versus this deck, because I bring in my removal and my Barrowglyphs because I'm expecting to play mid-range Magic against a Nadu deck in the sideboard. And that might be something, you might be getting the rug pulled on you and losing to Nadu even harder than you need to, but that's part of the strength. And if you don't respect that, maybe someone will identify what you've done, that you've boarded for their juke, and then they go back. And another important thing here is, even if you do land that Leyline of the Void or that Rest in Peace, Naduing until Thassa's Oracle is in your hand, and then starting to hit your Cephalid Illusionist and just milling your deck into exile and then casting Thassa's Oracle is part of the plan here. If they can beat Graveyard Hate, even like Leyline of the Void Stompy, game 1, turn 0 Leyline, they can beat that easily by just Cephaliding their deck into the Void once they have the Thassa's Oracle rolled up. You got to respect all of the angles of this.
It reminds me of something that you talked about a couple months ago, where you were talking about the Demir Reanimator mirror match and what level each person was on. And I think the game plan that you described works really well if you're both on the same level, or if your opponent you think is smart enough to board out the Drevator Narc amoebas. But if they're not, like if they're just like herder, nomad, cephalid illusionist, you might be like, oh damn, I have this Bargoyf in my hand right now, or it could have been a Fairy Macabre. So you have to respect your opponent enough to do it, and if they're not, you might have to change your game plan for game 3. So like Brian said, be prepared for the rug to be pulled out from you, but also make a judgment on if you think your opponent is on the right level. And, it's a feel bad if your opponent isn't, but I've made that call sometimes in paper, like looking at your opponent and be like, do they own the Tabernacle? I don't think so. I'm going to empty the Warrens. Like, that's not the worst thing to do.
Right, and that's a conversation I had over the Buffalo Chicken Dip weekend. I played against Nadu Breakfast 4 times, and on Tamir Tempo, I went 4-0, 8-0. I did not drop a game, and not one single game was close. And that's probably because I have Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, Daze, Force of Will, Orcish Bowmaster, 3 main deck Nile Spell Bombs. Like, I came to beat this deck, and I did. And that's with the sideboard plan. I even cut down to 1 Nile Spell Bomb out of the sideboard to make more room for threats and removal, because that's just not what game 2 is going to be about. And I had that conversation with some of my locals. Like one of the locals was one of the people I played and walloped respectfully. But we were chatting about that afterwards. And it's like, I know that Larson's sideboard guide tells you to cut your combo stuff. So then I can be the mid-range deck that counters your mid-range deck. And I know that you're on Larson's sideboard guide. And I wonder if someone had the courage to just frickin' send it. Just present their game 1 deck, would I be cooked? Or does a deck like Demir just have enough natural resilience, enough Fatal Pushes and Bowmasters that we could pick off Nomads before that's even a problem? And that is, of course, context you have to consider if you are like Red Stompy, where Nomad Illusionist Force of Will beats your ass, then you probably, like, pitching Fury or sacking something to Broadside Bombardier is not the same way to it's not the same counterplay against Illusionist that Fatal Push is. And you just have to understand the full context of the matchup before you do something like that.
So for those of you out there looking to beat Nadu, it's often difficult to target this deck with sideboard cards because they have really good resiliency. So, for example, if you Disruptor Flute or Pithing Needle a Shuko, there is still the Nomads in core to combo with. If you shut off the Graveyard, the Nadu into eventual Thassa's Oracle from hand is still live. There are hard cards that you can play that really shut down the deck. Clarion Conqueror, for example, is a real beating, but that is a 3-drop, and sometimes you're on the draw, and sometimes they turn 2 combo you, so...
Yeah, I mean, Pithing Needle on Nomad is really good. Like attacking the Nomad, whether that's Chalice of the Void, that's Pithing Needle. Nomad is kind of the core of a lot of this. The Breakfast build has a Shuko in it or 2. The mid-range build does not. So that Nomad is frequently the pinch point. If you have a Force of Will, think about just cutting Nomad out from under them before Nadu's on the stack. Like that. Those are the types of creative thinking that could get you there.
Back to Clarion Conqueror for a second. Phil, you mentioned the 3-drop against Daze Force of Will, but they also just have 4 Swords to Plowshares. Like, it is tough to get that card to stick. And, I mean, this episode's all about the white cards, and I think having the swords is one of the difference makers in Cephalid Breakfast right now. And if you look back a year or 2 ago, main deck copies of Swords to Plowshares was not normal, but in the current metagame where a lot of people are playing Dothy Voidwalkers, Cephalid Breakfast was sort of pushed into playing Swords to Plowshares, and I think it's actually a huge boon for that deck.
Right, and Swords to Plowshares does the important thing we've talked about of exiling the Archon of Cruelty or the Atraxa. Like sometimes Reanimator, and we've talked about this in a few different versions of scenarios on this pod many times, where they Entomb Reanimate, you plow the Atraxa in response to the trigger, and now they have no pressure. They spent 2 cards to get 3 to 5 more cards, but the Atraxa is gone. Now they have one other real win con in their main deck, and Archon of Cruelty, same thing. Like that might come in, kill a Nomad, take a card out of your hand, you plow it, and now they're out. There's no pressure again. And the combo deck will eventually win if they're under no pressure, even if the opponent does get a small to medium reload along the way.
We've been talking about Cephalid Breakfast, but I think back to Phil's point about them being really good at answering hate, the mid-range version of the deck is actually much better at interacting than Cephalid Breakfast is, because they have the green cards. Like this episode is about the white cards, but the mid-range build, the one that is more Delighted Halfling, Nomads and Core, that sort of thing, often playing Green Sun Zenith, they get to play Endurance and Force of Vigor. As a combo deck facing the mid-range build, I'd almost rather face Cephalid Breakfast than face the mid-range build, just because the mid-range build has so much more, and I can never beat Cephalid Breakfast. So I think that says something about the fast win, backed by Force of Will, Daze, everything else, but also having Force of Vigor and Endurance.
Right, the mid-range build, if we're ready to transition into the mid-range build away from Breakfast, the difference is this deck does not have a proper combo. When the Breakfast build does its thing, that you lose. The game is literally over. Thassa's Oracle, trigger, it's done. This deck does not do that at all. This deck it's a mid-range deck. It's got Swords to Plowshares, Force of Will, there's no Daze here. It's got cards like Teferi Time Raveler, a nice little Green Sun Zenith package. We've got a Keen-Eyed Curator, a Sylvan Safekeeper, maybe an Uro. They're playing pretty normal, fair Bant control Magic. Except if they happen to get Nomads, Encore, and Nadu in play at the same time, they suddenly draw somewhere between 4 and 28 cards. And then most decks can't beat them from that position. But there is no spam until it's over. It's spam until you can't beat what I have. And then they still have to go into combat a bunch of times with the Nadu and deal 20. So that's the important difference in this deck. But looking at this list, 2 Prismatic Ending main, 4 Plow, 4 Force, the Zeniths to get all the bullets, like the Keen-Eyed Curators, the hate pieces. Uro can grind in matchups to Fairy shutting down counter magic. They even have some cool stuff in their mana base. There's a Paseju, a Caracas, multiple Surveil lands. Most have the Hedge Maze and the Lush Portico. This deck is getting value out of every piece of itself along the way. And the secret mode of Nadu in this deck of 3/4 flying is also really potent. Just bricking up Dragon's Rage Channeler, Tameo, Delver of Secrets, Orcish Bowmaster, like any little thing you're trying to chip with, that's over. And if you want to deal with Nadu, it's going to cost you at least 1 card to even get into the space where you're fighting over Nadu. And then Nomads is in there somewhere. And this deck just plays really fair until it suddenly doesn't.
The Nadu size, it's so huge by legacy standards. Even a bunch of the fair white or green creatures that you might play with don't make it through a Nadu. You know, an Anointed Peacekeeper, like that's a stompy creature. That doesn't get through. Your Fable of the Mirrorbreaker tokens, those don't get through. It walls stuff really well. And when you wall traditionally solid threats and are threatening a combo finish every turn of the game, and you can Teferi bounce things out of play, and you have a bunch of fair white removal, like Nadu is just absolutely infuriating to play against as a fair mage. Like this Nadu mid-range build, it's so tough to beat. And they also just win combats with flash with things like Endurance.
I remember watching one of the Wizard streams where they talked about the Nadu design, and the reason they made it a 3/4 is they wanted it to live through Lightning Bolt in Modern. And it's just like kind of mind-blowing because like it already replaces itself when it's targeted. So the fact that like it needed to live through Lightning Bolt and replace itself when it was targeted, so you have to play white removal to kill it. I guess Fatal Push does it. But the fact that they didn't want it to die to Lightning Bolt is just kind of wild.
Yeah, clearly mistakes were made on that one. I think it's safe to say that they were balancing around all the wrong stuff when the card itself was fundamentally broken. One more thing I want to say about Nadu midrange is just kind of looking at some of the folks who choose to play it, because Nadu midrange is 1% of the Goldfish meta right now. It's deck number 23 at the time of this recording. Like, it's deep in the low tiers of Legacy. Yet, this past weekend at the Steel City Spectacular, it was 3 copies in the top 8, piloted by Brady Monroe. That's Einstein online. He is a young up-and-coming player. I don't know if he's a household name yet, but he should be. Jarvis Yu, we've heard of him, and Patrick Green, previous Eternal Weekend champion. So those are the 3 people who, out of anything they could have done, chose this. And these are not unskilled players. They are not players who have card availability issues. Like, these aren't people who would pick a pet deck over a good deck. Like, these are people who have resumes and are choosing to do this and showing up and winning 100% events with it.
And there are other Nadu decks out there that you can play. So, for example, there is a Nadu Elves deck out there that just seeks to be very fast and very consistent. So, like, no time for cantrips. We're on Green Sun Zenith, Chord of Calling, Once Upon a Time. Just, like, assemble your stuff as quickly as you can. So, like, if you are looking to fire quickly, this is an angle you can take.
Right, and Nadu Elves dumpsters Nadu midrange, because they have all your same stuff, but they're so much faster than you. However, Nadu Breakfast probably dumpsters Elves, because Elves just doesn't have any removal for the deck that has a proper combo in it. And there is like an interesting rock, paper, scissors among the Nadu decks here. But Nadu Elves is worth noting here because it's a way to play Nadu, but to the theme of our episode of where are the white cards, not in this deck, they're in the sideboard. This deck has, while the other Nadu decks we mentioned are Swords to Plowshares, Force of Will decks, this one is not. It has some plows in the sideboard for when they're necessary, but they don't get to play Force of Will at all. There's not enough blue cards. And then there's also the Beach Vacation, the Nadu Plagon deck, which brings together a bunch of the things we've talked about already here, where that deck doesn't play Nomads in core, but it does play Plagon, who can target Nadu as well. Not quite as well as Nomad, but it's a mana sink to do that. And it's a ETB draw a million. And that deck also plays Stoneforge Mystic, who we've mentioned a few times on this episode as well, who can tutor 1 copy of Shuko to pop off with Nadu. And that's kind of even more fair mid-range than the mid-range deck is. Like, I think the dedicated Zenith mid-range versus the Nadu Plagon deck, which has a critical mass of threats, versus Zenith to find the specific one you want. There's a lot of flavors of this, and any deck that can go crazy bonkers while including Swords to Plowshares is worth a look here.
Notably, I usually don't beat Plagon Lord of the Beach. When that card resolves, it's often a draw 3 or a draw 4, and horrible things tend to happen. Like, I believe I went positive in Legacy recently with Walls featuring Plagon.
I don't think I've ever beat the Plagon deck when I queue into it with normal Magic decks. I'm not out there grinding with Reanimator, which I think is the difference, but I'm out there trying to play mid-range decks or fund different things for the channel, and I have never beaten that Plagon deck in the wild.
I won't lie, this conversation made me look up Plagon for the first time because I've never faced it. This card is wild.
Yeah.
Do you want to read it for the audience in case they don't know about it?
Sure. So Plagon, Lord of the Beach. 2 and a blue, 3 mana total for a legendary creature, Starfish Wizard. When Plagon enters, draw a card for each creature you control with a toughness greater than its power. Well, that's pretty sweet. And then for a hybrid white-blue, target creature you control assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power, and it's a 0/3 creature.
Right, so creatures with toughness greater than their power include Nadu, Plagon itself, Delighted Halfling, Noble Hierarch, Stoneforge Mystic,
Tamiyo.
And also, Plagon is a wizard, so is Tamiyo, so is Nadu. The pieces are all there, folks. This deck is sweet if you haven't seen it.
And with that, why don't we go ahead and take a quick break before we go into our final section. All right, and welcome back. So for this final section, let's talk about good, honest, basic Plains decks that are playing traditional white creatures. And I want to refer to a Magic Online challenge from August 16th, where we have a first and second place finish going to Death and Taxes, and a top 8 finish going to a life gain warp deck that is pretty darn neat.
Right, and I want to shout out as well the first and second place players here. The first place player also won the Legacy Showcase qualifier and is headed straight to the Pro Tour and the mocks for that. And the second place Death and Taxes player has another challenge top 8 the same week, maybe even the same day, actually. And so there are a handful of players out here doing the work for Basic Planes.
And in all fairness, it's not just Basic Planes as far as Death and Taxes goes. The deck used to regularly be mono white, and you would splash if the metagame called for it. Occasionally you'd be black for Thoughtseize or for an Orzhov Pontiff or red for a Magus of the Moon. Now Death and Taxes is just base black-white. Overlord of the Baelmerk is just so strong with Felia, and Thoughtseize, as we already talked about in this episode, is just such a key part of current Legacy that it is borderline mandatory in the deck.
Yep, and Orcish Bowmasters, naturally.
Yeah, pretty good card. So Death and Taxes historically just dumpsters any Delver-style deck. You just have so much inevitability there with stuff like equipment and all of the blink value, and you have very, very good white removal. And the current iteration of Death and Taxes maybe does that better than any build ever, because you get to Solitude creatures to remove them in the early game, and then your Overlord of the Baelmerk gets them back, and then Felia starts blinking it, or the Overlord gets its attack trigger, and then there is this borderline never-ending stream of removal versus fair decks.
Yeah, I've of course played a lot of control decks for Death and Taxes, and it is really difficult, high-skill Magic that the games will last a long time, and you do have to collapse their engines in certain ways, and if they sneak something like Recruiter of the Guard into a Flicker Wisp, you might be too far behind to ever come back. There's and Felia, and Phil was talking about Overlord of the Baelmerk. There's so many engines here that if you're not clowning them, they will solve any problem. And right now, a lot of decks are trying to stop people from clowning, and maybe that's a spot where a deck like Death and Taxes can thrive. If the unfair decks are being checked by the fair decks in the meta, and you're feasting on the fair decks in the meta, while also still having some respectable plan for the unfair ones, that's a good place to be.
If you're a returning player to Legacy, you might be thinking about how Death and Taxes used to be the deck policing a little bit. They were the Aethersworn Canonist, Thalia Guardian of Thraben, Sanctum Prelate deck. None of that sees play anymore. I would just like to say, they're more of a fair deck now than ever. The build that did really well by Adam Wesmo is playing 2 main deck Containment Priest and 1 Fairy Macabre, but there's no Thalia Guardian of Thraben or anything like that in these decks. It's pretty rare.
There's no Mother of Runes.
Yeah, exactly. Bad against Orcish Bowmasters. But there used to be a time where those were all expected. And now when I face Death and Taxes, I am always surprised if my opponent has any copies of Thalia still in their 95. I guess that's the number.
Yeah, I agree. This is unrecognizable if you haven't played Legacy in a few years, but all of the things make a lot of sense for what's going on right now. I do think it's kind of a little funny and perverse that multiple copies of Containment Priest are in the deck built around flickering your own creatures. This deck contains Yorion, Felia, and Flicker Wisp. Felia and Flicker Wisp can just target your opponent's creatures that get deleted permanently if you have a priest, and Yorion can pick up the priest with everything else, so everything comes back. But it is just funny that here we are. Aether Vial also in this deck, by the way. That's a combo with Containment Priest. They are clearly bending what they want to be doing with what they must be doing, and that's a sign of somebody doing the work to figure out what they need to do in the format.
And in terms of doing the work, if you are playing against this deck, I think your brain needs to be trained on Felia more so than anything else. If your opponent passes with 2 mana, you might need to just not do the thing you want to do on your turn, so you don't get just absolutely housed by Felia on turn 3. Because there's such a huge difference between I cast Felia, I swords it, and I cast Felia, untap, Overlord of the Baelmerk, trigger, Felia, attack, blink Overlord of the Baelmerk. That comes back at end step, trigger again, and then you remove the Felia on the following turn. So like sometimes you just have to eat a really, really bad and noticeable tempo hit to not let that happen.
Right. These matchups are not about tempo. That has to be understood. Even if you're a tempo deck, they will not let you make the matchup about tempo, and it will be about control. And Phil mentioned Overlord of the Baelmerk, Recruiter of the Guard does the same thing. Even like White Orchid Phantom blowing up 2 lands in a turn. If you're a tempo deck, you probably don't have 2 basics to get. This quickly spirals out if you let Felia start doing stuff.
And as far as the sideboard goes, if you're winning a lot of these fair fights in game ones, you can dedicate, most of your sideboard slots to the unfair stuff. So it's pretty common that you will see maybe 2 or 3 fair removal spells in the sideboard, your Path to Exile, Wrath of the Skies type stuff. And then the rest is just a pile of Deafening Silence, Disruptor Flute, Fairy Macabre, Leyline of the Void, Mindbreak Traps, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I love that Adam's 95 card deck has 3 Leyline of the Void in the sideboard. Like, this is someone who did the math and really figured out what the slots should be used for. Because to me, I don't like playing 4 Leylines in 60 card decks, and he's got 80 and he's playing 3. And I don't think this is, I'm certain this is not random. I'm certain this is from hard work. And when you see something like 3 Leyline in a 95 card deck, someone's done the work here.
Speaking of doing the work, there was this total dark horse deck in this challenge in the 5th through 8th slots. It's labeled as Death and Taxes, but it absolutely isn't. It is a mono white warp deck featuring Exalted Sunborn, Halia, Guided by Light, and Starfield Shepherd. All of which I am sure that the average Legacy viewer or listener has not seen in play before.
That's a safe bet, Phil.
All right, so quickly glossing over them. Exalted Sunborn is a 5-mana 4/5 flying lifelinker. If 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, you make twice that many instead. And it has Warp for 2 mana. So it has synergy with Ocelot Pride, allowing you to make an absolutely stupid number of cats, like maybe multiple rows of Magic Online levels of cats. And you can Felia it or Ephemerate it as well. There is Halia Guided by Light, which is a 3-mana 3/3 human soldier. Whenever it or another creature or artifact you control enters, you gain a life. So again, synergy with the whole Guide of Souls Ocelot Pride thing. And more importantly, at the beginning of your end step, draw a card if you've gained 3 or more life this turn. This one has Warp for a single mana. And the final one, Starfield Shepherd, is a 5-mana 3/2 flyer. When it enters, search your library for a basic Plains card or a creature card with mana value 1 or less, and put it into your hand. And it has Warp for 2 mana. So this deck has 3 different Warp cards that it can play to trigger Guide of Souls and then get massive value with Felia or Ephemerate. And the cool thing about Warp is that you can then cast these cards for their full mana cost later on from exile.
Phil, I faced a deck that is very similar to what you're describing, but they played a turn 2 Voice of Victory, and I was like, oh, that's cool. And then they played one of these Warp cards, and I was like, okay, I'm going to take a bunch of damage here. But then my life total became 0, and I was like, wait, what? Like, I did not expect all of the triggers to pump up all of their creatures that quickly. Like, I'm pretty sure they dealt me lethal on turn 3. It might have been turn 4, but I was combo killed by Death and Taxes. Like, that's what it felt like.
Yeah, this deck is so much better than it looks. I saw this and recorded with it this afternoon. Spoilers, I guess, but I went 4-1, and I absolutely trashed anything that resembled a fair deck. Warp puts your opponent in these incredibly awkward and difficult positions. So on the surface, you would think, okay, they've got a Felia in play, and they warp this creature. I'll just answer the Felia and everything's fine. Well, that's not actually true. You didn't actually answer the warped card. Like, yeah, maybe it doesn't do anything that turn, but you didn't take that card away. And you can just then later cast that at 3 mana or 5 mana, and you didn't actually stop that card. You just stopped the grossest thing they can do with that card.
Yeah, there's a lot of Ocelot Pride stuff happening in the format right now on kind of the fringes. And this card is one of those cards, one of these strategies that if you blink for a second, your Fatal Pushes and Lightning Bolts will not help you anymore. It's too late. And these are the decks that Wrath of the Skies, Supreme Verdict, and Terminus would be cleaning up, except those cards are not really to be found in the format, per the whole conversation that we've had for the last hour. This is feasting on the hole in the metagame where they're going to try to survive the combo one way or another, and then they will do something that cannot be caught up with. This list has 2 Chrome Mox in it, so they are ready to throw cards into the void to get short-term advantage, understanding that if the game goes long, that will snowball to a place that nobody can stop them.
So, Brian, you've been playing blue-black tempo. Like, are you prepared to answer a 5 mana 4/5 flying lifelinker? Like, that dodges Fatal Push. Like, that is such a huge problem.
Yeah, you'd probably just have to counter it on the way down or put a Murktide Region in front of it. And the tools are there, but I have played with Dimir Tempo versus these decks, and play draw is huge. Like, can my Bowmaster snag their Ocelot Pride or not before it starts doing its thing? If I have a Fatal Push and they lead on Guide of Souls, do I just pick it off? Or do I hold that push to deal with Ocelot Pride? Because I don't really care about Soul Warden, but I care a lot about Ocelot Pride. But Ocelot Pride might not do anything if they don't have their Soul Warden, and it's a crazy puzzle to solve. This can become very challenging very quickly.
It feels like it has so many extra cards in hand than you would expect a mono white deck that isn't physically drawing cards to have because of this warp stuff. Sometimes the cards aren't overly impressive. So for example, Halia, the 3 mana one that is just a Soul Sister essentially, that is probably the least impressive of them. But Starfield Shepherd tutoring for Ocelot Pride or Guide of Souls or Basic Planes, or going way back to older formats, Speaker of the Heavens, that 1/1 Vigilant Lifelink creature that you can tap to make a 4/4 Angel if you have effectively 27 or more life. It is surprisingly good.
Yep, for sure. And with our last few minutes, do we want to talk about Jeskai Wizards real quick?
Yeah, I love that deck. I think that deck is very, very fun to play.
Right. So, yeah, this Jeskai Wizards deck has kind of popped out. And the big problem with blue-white control right now, or blue-white X, let's call it Jeskai, let's call it Esper, let's call it 4-color, whatever. But the blue-white, if you want to have more than one basic island and any number of basic planes in your deck at the same time, this is the shell we're talking about. The problem with these decks is they have to do so much to answer the breadth of the format. You have to be ready for Archon of Cruelty and Ocelot Pride and Dark Ritual all at the same time. And that's really tough for these decks to do. You also need to be able to check Tamiyo, which basically every deck has in it. And if you dedicate enough slots to answer all those things, it becomes very hard to win the game. A lot of the Jeskai control decks lately have had like one copy of 4th Aerolingus somewhere in there and one copy of Mystic Sanctuary in case that gets discarded or countered. And otherwise, they're just running on air. Flame of Enor covers a lot of that ground. Just Kolaghan's command style 2-for-1 that does what you need it to, and the base mode is just divination. Even when it's not doing its job, it'll do something.
Let me cut in there on that. So when I played a league with this recently, I was super surprised how often targeting my opponent with the draw 2 ability was relevant. Like in my league, I queued into multiple Thassa's Oracle combo decks. I think I played against Doomsday and Oops or something like that. And the ability for that to do all of the things that it normally is supposed to do, and also be a just, ha, got you, juke, versus decks that maybe aren't expecting that, it's really big.
Yes, yeah, that is a very important part of Flame of Anor. The wizards in this deck are 4 copies of Tamiyo, who has been discussed on this podcast quite a bit. Obviously, the best card in the format right now. There's 4 Thundertrap Trainers, which is now a vintage staple. Thundertrap Trainer being a 2-for-1 immediately, and then as the game goes along, which it will, because that's how your deck's constructed, being a 3 or a 4-for-1. If you offspring it, you get 2 bodies and 2 impulses. And of course, all of these things turning on Flame of Enor. There's even a 1 of Magus of the Moon, who, surprise, is a wizard in some of these lists to shut down the lands and the 12 post and the Mystic Forge endgames that dominate these sort of decks going long. This deck is pretty sweet and pretty well constructed. And of course, given the preview of our episode today, there are 4 copies of Swords to Plowshares to slowly pick off that Atraxa, pick off that Archon of Cruelty, and then win with whatever's left, because your opponent won't really have anything.
The flex slots of these decks are a little tricky. You need to be doing something with your flex slots that impacts combo. And in doing my analysis leading up to my videos, I was finding that there's some debate between whether or not you want Force of Negation in the main or something like Spell Pierce in the main, where Force of Negation is the hard no that works all game, but sometimes you end up pitching a card to it. And Pierce comes down early, is very impactful early, but peters off later on.
There's another card that's popped up in some of these lists that I've also seen in some Blue-White Dreadnought lists lately, and that's Minor Misstep. That card is extremely well positioned right now. It gets Tameo, it gets Entomb, it gets Reanimate, it gets Nomad's Encore, it gets the Thoughtseizes that we've talked about. If the format is about 0 and 1 mana spells, Minor Misstep gets them. And unlike Spell Pierce, you don't have to worry about your Reanimator player getting their combo together on turn 6, because Misstep will still hit the Entomb then, where Spell Pierce will not. Just very cool to see that card popping up.
I've started boarding in all of my bounce spells against these Jeskai decks, which sounds a little bit odd, but in my experience, they almost always have Lavinia, and then the supplemental card to complement Lavinia is Clear and Conquer or Deafening Silence, and I need a way to deal with that. Like, I find as a Storm combo deck, you can usually outclass their counter magic at some point, but if they resolve Lavinia or a secondary hate piece, it becomes a lot more difficult. So you have to be prepared for the sideboard haymakers as a combo player.
For sure. Yeah, I've been saying on this podcast for years, if you want to be control and beat spell combo, you need lock pieces. You can't rely on counter spells to do that.
Just as a closing thought here, in addition to like the warp deck that we talked about that is using Ocelot, Pride, Guide of Souls, I have found that there is a lot of energy in leagues, even if it is not necessarily a top deck in Legacy. I think people, myself included, really like playing with the energy decks that are usually Boros. Sometimes they go into black as well. It is a powerful strategy that can come out of the gates very, very quickly. Amped Raptor gives you some very, very broken starts. Goblin Bombardment and Broadside Bombardiers can give you ways to close out games and make you better at flipping a Ajani into a Planeswalker. There is a lot to like in that shell, but if you're Boros Energy, you don't have the card Thoughtseize.
So I guess to wrap this up, the answer to the question that we asked at the top of the episode of where is white, the answer is chock full tier 2 and 3 decks, being suppressed by mostly the cards Thoughtseize and Tameo, but there are white decks to play, and some of them are bumping at that ceiling, especially the Nadu shells right now.